All right, let's get rolling here. So heads. Heads are complicated, aren't they? Even when they're idealized, beautifully stylized. So this ideal realism is still an immense amount of info, immense amount of information we got to deal with. So, and this is a very simplified version of the anatomy, but tons of stuff. So if we dive into the tons of stuff, we get overwhelmed. There's a good chance that we'll spend months or years doing a lot of it wrong. And none of that's good. So when I work, I want to come up with a layer first. I want to come up with a layer. I want to come up with several or a few or a couple ideas. And I'm going to draw my ideas. And if I can get very clear on the ideas I'm trying to draw, then I have at least a little more objective way to say, well, that's not quite right. That's better. And I've got a better chance of figuring out why it's not quite right or why it's better. And so that's what I want. So when I do this, I'm not drawing a tube. I'm drawing an idea about this tube, an idea of its position, its proportion, its character. And if I can do it as simply as possible, it makes life easier. And if I screw it up, which is going to happen a lot, even when I'm late in my career, probably, I know it is for me, if I can start simply, I can learn to see the mistakes quicker, correct them quicker, with less pain and suffering. I'm not 20 hours into this render and realize the eyes are out of whack. So I want to get it as simple as I can. And then as we've talked about really every lesson, but it bears repeating because it's one of the most important principles, one of the most important set of ideas I have. I try and make things as simple as I possibly can and yet as characteristic. So it might be a tube in this particular position, leaning to the left at the top and coming towards us at the bottom. And it might also be a tapering tube. So this would be the same simple idea, but slightly more characteristic of what I see. It could be that the tube needed to be a little shorter as well. It could be that it's tapering, but really it's just tapering on one side, not both sides. And it could be that it's actually tapering on both sides, but one side is a S-curve. And I'll keep reimagining this, trying to simplify it when I get in trouble, try and make it slightly or greatly more characteristic right to begin with. If I can make it more characteristic, then if I have to stop, I've got the idea down pretty well. And it's going to tend to connect better, more beautifully, more truthfully to the next thing, say the hand or something. So that's kind of the ideas we're going to start with. And then in terms of the head, what we did was we started with the idea that there's the skull shape, it's this big simple shape, and the mask of the face. And if we can take the features off, it's fairly simple. Doesn't mean it's easy to draw, but it's simple to work with. We can reduce it down. And if I can get those related together in a simple yet characteristic way, showing in this case that the skull goes back and oftentimes slightly up, and the face comes down. And so the angle between is slightly more than a right angle. That's more characteristic. And so it rings more true than getting that skull maybe straight, horizontal, face straight, vertical, or even something less so. So simple yet characteristic. And I'll play with that simple idea over and over and over again. I call it iterations. It's strategic play. I'll draw it again, it'll be better or worse. And then I'll draw it again. Well, you know, actually I think it will be a better drawing. I'll have a better chance of success if I pick a color that's a little more beautiful and a value that's much lighter. So if I screw it up, I can correct it and less damage is done. And then when I get confident, then I can start building my detail, whatever that means. Maybe all my shading. For the front of the face and the front of the forehead. And I can keep building on that and eventually make it really dark. But at each point, if I keep it lighter and softer, a little more elegant color if I'm dealing with any color at all, even if it's just going to be all the same color, that's more pleasing. It settles me and it relaxes me. I'm getting something down that's beautiful. Even if the mark is off, it's a beautiful mark. And so I'll start lighter and then I'll render darker. And at the end of it, I might go quite dark. And then those lighter marks will kind of ghost out, disappear. So I'll try and set myself up for success. I don't have to get it the first time right. I can do it 15 or 20 if I have the patience, the tenacity, or am making progress so it's a pleasure. I like to see, that's clearly wrong. That helps. That's clearly much better. That helps even more. And move through that. And then what we talked about was creating the LTL. So we've got the face going down and the skull going back. That's an L, even though it's an upside down L. And then if we start to get anything other than a profile or a back view, we'll get more than that L. We'll get the L. And for simplicity's sake, it's not quite as characteristic, but for simplicity's sake, I'll oftentimes group the skull going back and the face going down together into one simpler shape. And then I'll get a T. The T will be at the eye line or the eyebrow line. And it'll go from one eyebrow to the other, so we don't get to see that, do we, from a profile. But if we're in a 3/4 view or a front view, we can go from arching eyebrow to arching eyebrow. And that becomes the T. So we don't see the T here, or we see a sliver of it maybe. And we can see a little bit of the beginning of this eyebrow, a little bit of the beginning of that eyebrow, a little bit of a T. And then we get the other, there's the T. And then we get the other L, which is the eyebrow line or the eye line to the ear. And when we bring all three of those together, the LTL, we can map out any head in any position. And even if we're missing some of the letters, we can get the L and not get the T and not get anything but a little sliver, a little bit, not really a sliver, a foreshortened chunk of one stroke of the L from eyebrow line, or the best we could see, eye socket to ear. And how we relate those L's and those T's and the L's in whole or in part, all we're getting is a L1/2, basically. But by paying attention to that and making a simple statement out of that difficult position, of that difficult head, we now get a pretty good understanding. Oops. Of where that head's sitting. And what will happen if we can relate the L to the features, to the eye sockets, whether it's the eye line or the eyebrow line or some other landmark that's equivalent from side to side, and to the top of the ear, whether the ear sits lower near the eye line or not. I like it at the eyebrow line. But seeing that relationship and seeing how close the ear gets. Let's do this. How close the ear gets to the back of the skull, it becomes very close to bumping up to the back of the skull. Or how close the ear gets to the front of the face, gets very close to the front of the face. Then that gives us a way to measure and move, and simply by dropping an eyebrow lower compared to another eyebrow, and let's do it this way, simply by dropping an eyebrow or an eye socket lower, and the ear lower, and the ear closer to the front of the face, or the ear farther from the front of the face or closer to the back of the head, we can start to get that head in any position we want if we can build off that LTL idea. There's the other L. In this case, that L is quite a sharp turn back. There's the T. In this case, the T is lifting up off axis, that cross stroke. And there's the other L. And then we'll find everything maps off those three sets of coordinates, basically, to use a complicated term. So let's see how that works. So if we look at one of the most famous and most beautiful drawings in history, Michelangelo's Study for the Sibyl, let's find those landmarks. Here is the L. And notice that as soon as we do that L and do it well, we'll notice usually, not always, but usually it's slightly more than a right angle, opened up a little bit. And we'll notice that the jaw, the chin, I should say, is pushed to the right, and the forehead hairline is pushed to the left, and the front of the skull at the hairline, more or less, compared to the back of the skull before it rolls down into its egg, gets higher in the back and lower in the front. So it helps us very quickly to get a very accurate, or it could be a stylized, a more dynamic, say, version of what we see. We plot that down, and we're bumping off a little bit of the chin, a little bit of the barrel of the mouth and the nose, that's our muzzle, a little bit of the forehead, brow ridge, I should say. And I could do that right down the center line. Oops. Down the center line and make that the L. And then add the extra bit of the face on beyond that. Add that extra later. Or we can do it as I did. Go to the simplified outside and add the center line later. And anything close. It doesn't have to be exactly right. So I've got the L. Now I've got the T going. And there's the eyebrow line. So I'm looking at this this little bump, and I'm figuring it's about here, but I don't have to be super accurate. Maybe it was here. Maybe it was here. Anywhere in there is fine. You can use a little tone as the forehead bumps back to the nose, the little tone in there. Any of those things are fine. But I'll pick that spot. That's my T. And then here's my L. I'm going to use the same eye or eyebrow line going back to the top of the ear. And notice I missed it a little bit. We're not even sure which line Michelangelo decided was the best. Is it up here, up here? Probably there, but we're not sure. And it wouldn't matter. Close enough. There's my other L. L, T, L. And every time I make a stroke on the L's or the T's, I want to compare it to a vertical and a horizontal. Is that T perfectly horizontal and perfectly vertical? And same with the L's, as they would be in perfectly drawn letters. Or are they dropping down, or raising up, or tilting back, or thrusting forward? Get a sense, and I can check it with my pencil if I need to. So that's what I'm looking for. And I want to plot that out when I'm analyzing some beautiful reference or beautiful old masters, and I want to really understand it. I'll draw right over the top. And then I'll start to see a very interesting thing. In a real face in real life, or in a beautifully observed, copied, or stylized drawing, if it's going to be realistic and not impressionistic or expressionistic, you're going to see everything cohere, everything map in the same way. So notice we had that eyebrow line right there. Notice the tip of the nose, the line of the mouth. You can see a little bit of the hair of the eyelashes. You can see where this bumps there. That tone before the tone turns back this way. This bump here with this darkening here, the hairline here, the lower lip. The chin rounds off a little bit and doesn't track it. So not every time, but most of the time, it's going to track that way. And you'll even find it tracking along other tones sometimes. So it's good. You're going to see that over and over and over again. The front of the lid as opposed to the side of the lid. Even if you square it off, you'll see it usually tracks this way. Not every time, but almost all the time. And if I was going to screw this up, I would screw it up to align with my box logic, is what I call it. Because if we think of something as a box, the top of the box and the bottom of the box, and if it were a wall, the top frame and the mullions of the window and all the side planes would all track in the same box logic in parallel. Well, that's not quite true, is it? It actually converges to a vanishing point if you know anything about linear perspective. We don't have to be that fussy because we're dealing with the organic forms, so we can just keep them perfectly parallel. You could diminish them. If I'm drawing a real big head for a class, I might do that. Oftentimes do that, but it wouldn't matter because you'll round this off. And once you've round that off, it'll hide any subtle imperfections. So now let's look at the side planes. Not only do the front planes go this way, the side planes tend to follow, not always exactly the same, but very similar directions. So notice the side planes, not every time, just like the chin, sometimes they'll go off. This jaw, if it wasn't for the digastric plane here squishing down in that pinch of the neck, the jaw could have gone this way. So not every time, but generally they'll start to go that way. And notice the clever artist will conspire to do it more often. Here's a head here, and the jaw comes up here. But the bottom plane, digastric plane, before we hit the neck, that will line up on that side plane. And then we might well get a head that say we're a little bit underneath. And the chin will track. So everything's going to track that way, or try to. And we want to encourage that if we need more structure. If we don't need more structure, no problem. So I'll try and get everything in alignment. And this was an incredible teacher for me. Michelangelo taught me more than anybody else about drawing. And it was this drawing that did most of it. And notice even little things like the tip of the nose. Well, that's just the underside of the nose, actually. But he still moved it in this same direction. And where the two inside corners, the bump, the tone here, the hatching here, is all tracking that boxy idea. Here he's bumping this way like there's a little corner plane, even like so. So it follows beautifully. So let's look at another one just so we can make sure we're clear on that. Let's see here. So if let's just play with the T and look what it gives us. So I'm going to go right down between the eyebrows, between, not the philtrum because it's going to build out a little bit, but somewhere in here. It doesn't have to be exactly right, but where the lips end and the chin begins, right in that natural center line. And let's lighten that up. We'll leave that little mark. There we go. Oftentimes I'll do these construction lines too long. I don't worry about going up to the top really, because oftentimes it slopes back, even if there's a widow's peak like Dracula, slopes back. So I'll oftentimes leave them short in there, but that's your choice. And notice this is a little off. It should be here. So you can be more accurate or not. You can adjust it in the rendering or not. You can stylize it or not. Sometimes I'll draw a couple lines knowing it's somewhere in between. So anywhere in there is good. It's organic, so we have room for error. So don't stress about that so much. And notice the eyebrows turn down here. Let's darken that up a little bit. The eyebrows turn down here and lift up and wave action here. I'm just going to pick this little section right in here and do that. And notice how conveniently the arch of the eyebrows, not every time, but often arch up and then fall. Or sometimes they'll arch up and stop. Spock, they always did that with Spock's eyebrows. There would be no fall. They shaved those or covered them up or whatever they did there. And that I think of as the corner of the head. So we have a front plane, simplified front plane of the forehead, and a side plane. We'll look at that another time. But we'll start to see these clues when we start thinking in box logic throughout that will give us front, side, top, bottom, center, symmetrical, other side, all that kind of stuff. So I'm looking here. I'm looking in here. Now I've got that T. If we go this way, I'm going to use that natural arch of the eyebrow usually. But again, it could be, here's the top of the lid, top of the lid. It could be this. And I'm going to go for the top of the ear. I can't quite see it. It stops here and gets lost. So I'll just assume it's here. Doesn't have to be exactly right. And there's my T and my L. I didn't bother to do this other T because we were just kind of looking at that face there. What I want to point out, though, is now watch what happens. We already picked up the top of the eyelids, so the eye line. If we could see the bottom of those lids, and it's basically where the lid goes behind the nose, we could pick up that. If I wanted to get the bottom of the nose, where the tip goes from front to bottom, I could do it here. I could do the bottom of the nose where it meets the face, the mouth specifically. And if I was going over the curl of the mouth, it could be where the nostril bumps on that curl, rises up into that central septum area where the nostrils are, and go right to the other side and pick it out. The lips. Notice they're not perfect, although you can make them perfect, I oftentimes do. Top of the nose even. They may not be perfect, you could make them perfect. To really chisel things out on a much finer level, which we'll do at another time. But I'm just going to find all the angles of these front of the lips, front of the opening between the two lips, top of the lower lip, bottom of the lower lip, pinch where the lower lip meets the chin, where the front of the chin starts to tuck under. Now notice that it's rounded versions of that that's hidden in the beautiful fluid curves, but it's all there. And then that not only plots out our structure, so everything's structured correctly. If I could see the other pupil, that would be there too, unless it was cockeyed or something. So not only does it plot out all the big and all the small, more refined features and elements, but it maps out our rendering. Because look what's going to happen. We're going to, let me change the color now. All of the dark shading will track that same idea. And if it happens to not track, it looks really strange, doesn't it? So we start to see just by the construction lines, or just by the shadow shapes, eventually by all the subtleties of contour and subtle tones, they're going to mimic and track that simple box logic. So if we get this right, then all of our rendering is going to follow suit in a planned out, mapped out way. And when we don't get it right, we'll start to see it more quickly as a mistake, and we can correct that mistake if we need to. Or it gives us the limits or the idealization of the realism, and then we can depart from that, like a Picasso might, or a Cezanne might. So rich, rich possibilities. I don't have Leonardo anymore. Rich possibilities for doing a beautifully finished, stylized, idealized, conceptualized piece of work. So that's what that simple LTL will give you. The LTL is a product of our box logic idea. If we can figure out all the front planes, against all the side planes, good things are going to happen. They don't have to always line up perfectly. In fact, if we're drawing characters, they won't, but it gives us a place to begin. And I will oftentimes, taking my cue from Michelangelo, I will oftentimes force the character I'm drawing into the ideal I'm trying to embody. And so I'll push things into a truer box logic of side planes, at least for a little while before they go off into their own organic journey. But I'll try and look for that. So it maps out everything for us if we can get it. So start really simple. Try and find the LTL is going to show you the top against the front against the side, eventually the front and side against the bottom. It gives us a ton of power to work if we can develop that. And the best way I know is just to take drawings, and oftentimes smaller drawings, work small in a small, less ambitious size, and map out these little constructions. And I'll do it right over the old masters with tracing paper, or with digital, or whatever. All right. I really hope that helps and it made sense.